A police officer, his judgment clouded by prejudice, spots a black woman rummaging through a luxury vehicle and instantly concludes she's a car thief, leading to a wrongful arrest, only for him to discover his captive is, in fact, the new district attorney. Aria Sterling found herself trapped in the center of the sprawling parking lot, a slick sheen of perspiration clinging to her brow under the oppressive glare of the afternoon sun. Before her, the obsidian SUV sat vulnerable, its driver's side door gaping open as she leaned inside, her hands a blur, sifting through a chaotic landscape of documents and forgotten receipts in a desperate hunt for her vanished purse. Where is it? Where is it?" she whispered, a frantic mantra beneath her breath as her fingers danced through the clutter, a current of panic rising within her. A tight schedule had already been shattered upon her arrival, but this was a catastrophe in the making. For the third time her phone vibrated against the console, its screen glowing with yet another urgent, unanswered call from her office, a call she willfully ignored, her entire world narrowing to a single critical mission: locating the purse that held her wallet, her identification, the very keys to her existence. The low thrum of an approaching engine snagged her awareness, and she straightened just enough to see a police cruiser gliding slowly, predatorily, through the rows of cars. The officer behind the wheel fixed his gaze on her, and she quickly ducked back into her vehicle, hoping to become invisible, hoping to avoid a complication she absolutely had no time for. Yet she could feel the weight of his stare, a palpable presence, as the cruiser rolled to a silent stop just behind her. The car door creaked open, followed by the solid, heavy sound of boots meeting pavement. "Hey!" A voice like gravel sliced through the air. Aria froze instantly, her fingers hovering just over the car's leather seat, her heart plummeting as she slowly, deliberately rose to her full height, already feeling the inevitable collision course she was on. She drew a steadying breath and pivoted to face him. A white officer, etched with the lines of middle age, his face a mask of hard-won cynicism, a scowl seemingly carved into his features. His uniform was impeccably starched, a stark contrast to the careless disdain with which he wore his power, one hand resting possessively on his duty belt as his gaze, sharp and dismissive, raked over her from head to toe. "Just what do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice laced with an immediate, unfounded suspicion. Aria delicately swiped a drop of sweat from her temple, taking a small, non-threatening step away from her own car, battling to project an aura of pure calm. "I'm simply searching for my purse," she stated, her tone meticulously level and clear. "I seem to have misplaced it somewhere inside the car." The officer's scowl only deepened, his suspicion solidifying into conviction. "You have any identification on you?" he shot back, his hand remaining firmly planted on his belt, a silent promise of imminent action. Aria felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "As I just mentioned, I've lost my purse," she reiterated, gesturing with an open palm toward the SUV's interior. "That's precisely what I'm looking for. I am quite late for a meeting." "Uh-huh," the officer cut her off, his disbelief a palpable wall between them. "Late for a meeting, you say? Step away from the vehicle." Aria bit down hard on her tongue, stifling the retort that burned for release. She knew this was a fire she did not want to fuel. With measured slowness, she moved away from the car, raising her hand slightly, an open display of non-aggression. "This is my vehicle," she said again, her voice a pillar of steadiness. "I just need a moment to find my purse, and I will be on my way." But her words were just noise to him. He wasn't listening, not really. His eyes were locked on her, a disturbing cocktail of suspicion and something far uglier swirling in their depths. He advanced a step, his entire posture radiating rigid hostility. "Ma'am, you're acting incredibly suspicious right now. You really expect me to believe you just happened to lose your purse inside this specific vehicle?" His eyes darted to the SUV as if searching for some external proof that she was an intruder. Aria felt her carefully constructed patience begin to crack and fray. "Yes, because it is my car," she stated, her voice gaining a new, firmer edge. "I am the district attorney. I lost my purse, and that is why I am searching for it." The officer's eyebrow arched in derision, a mocking smirk twisting his lips. The district attorney, is that right? You got any proof of that? Because from where I'm standing, all I see is someone in the middle of a carjacking. Arya's jaw tightened. She didn't need this confrontation. Not on this day, not on any day, but especially not at this moment. I have told you, my identification is inside my purse, she said, straining to keep the raw frustration from poisoning her tone. The officer closed the distance between them, his hand now casually, menacingly, resting on the grip of his sidearm. Yeah, I heard you. Now step away from the vehicle, now! Arya opened her mouth to argue, to protest this injustice, but then she stopped. She saw the picture he had already painted in his mind. A lone black woman in a parking lot, rummaging through a high-end SUV, no ID. She understood precisely how men like this officer viewed women like her. She also understood that any further argument would only dig her deeper into the hole he had already dug for her. Taking a profound breath, she retreated further from the open car door, her mind racing, calculating how to de-escalate this spiraling nightmare. She was not afraid, but she was far from foolish. She knew how quickly, how tragically these encounters could turn. The officer, meanwhile, interpreted her compliance not as a sign of wisdom, but as a clear admission of guilt. He began to circle the SUV, peering inside before his focus snapped back to her. Hands where I can see them, he commanded, producing a pair of metallic handcuffs from his belt. Arya's eyes widened, a jolt of disbelief coursing through her. Wait, what? Are you being serious? I told you, this is my car. But the officer was deaf to her words. He lunged forward, seizing her arm with one powerful hand, while the other snapped the cold steel cuff around her wrist. Arya felt a surge of white-hot anger and utter disbelief as the metal bit into her skin, the lock clicking shut with a sound of finality. You're under arrest, the officer stated, his voice as cold and hard as the cuffs themselves, for suspicion of grand theft auto. Arya was reeling. Her purse, with all its proof of her identity, was somewhere within that vehicle, yet here she was, being treated as the criminal. As he marched her toward his patrol car, she cast a final, defiant look back at her own vehicle, a storm of frustration and rage building in her chest. This was not over. This was not even the beginning. Arya sat in the back of the police car, her wrists aching, still bound behind her. The vinyl seat was hard, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. She rested her head against the cage separating her from the front, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. This was not how her day was meant to unfold. Through the grimy window, she watched Officer Cade standing by her SUV, his flashlight beam cutting through the bright daylight as he peered inside. His suspicion not just lingering, but intensifying, fed by the narrative he had already authored in his mind. Arya sighed, her gaze sweeping across the mostly deserted parking lot. A few passers-by had noticed the scene earlier, their stares lingering on her in the back of the cruiser before they hurried on, their faces masks of discomfort. No one had stopped. No one had intervened. The rear door was wrenched open, and Cade's grim-faced silhouette filled the frame. He yanked her roughly from the car, spinning her around to face him. Still no ID? He sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. I told you, Arya replied, her voice steady but clipped. My purse is somewhere in my vehicle. If you would simply allow me to retrieve it, I can show you everything you need to see. Cade just shook his head, dismissing her words as if they were meaningless. You really expect me to believe that story? That you're just some innocent citizen who lost her purse? Please, it's obvious you were trying to steal that car. Arya inhaled deeply, wrestling her fury back into its cage. Look, officer, she began, forcing a calm she did not feel. I am the district attorney. That is my car. If you would just check the vehicle's registration or run a simple background check, you would see that everything is in order. District attorney, Cade let out a short, derisive bark of a laugh. Ma'am, you can't be serious. People like you don't get jobs like that. Now stop the lying, and maybe this will all go a little easier for you. Arya felt her jaw lock, the anger simmering just below the surface, threatening to boil over. People like me? She repeated, raising a single challenging eyebrow. What precisely do you mean by that? Cade sidestepped the question, leaning in, his face a mask of smug disdain. What I mean is, you're making this much harder than it has to be. You should have come up with a better story." "District Attorney," he scoffed again. "I've heard some whoppers, but that one's definitely up there." Arya stared him down, her patience worn to a single fragile thread. She had spent a lifetime working her way through law school, battling against every single assumption, every single barrier that people had erected in front of her because of the color of her skin. And now, standing here in handcuffs, facing this man who refused to even listen, all of that accumulated frustration roiled within her. "This is absurd," Arya muttered, more to herself than to him. "Oh, it's absurd, all right," Cade shot back, taking a step back as he waved over another patrol car. "You think you can just waltz in here, steal a high-end vehicle, and get away with it because you have some fantasy job title in your head? Not a chance." Arya shook her head, stunned by his willful ignorance. "I am telling you the truth. Why won't you just run the plates?" Cade glared at her, his irritation flaring. "Why? So you can buy yourself more time to cook up another lie? I know your type. You've probably got a record a mile long. You think you're smarter than me, but you're not." Arya had to physically restrain herself from snapping back. She knew better than to engage with a man like Cade in this situation. Still, every word he spoke was a stinging slap. He wasn't interested in truth. He was only interested in the story he had already written, the one where he was the hero and she was the villain. The second officer, a younger man with an uneasy look, approached them holding a clipboard. He glanced from Arya to Cade. "Everything under control here?" the younger officer asked, his voice hesitant. Cade waved a dismissive hand. "Just a routine bust. She's spinning some wild tale about being the district attorney or something. No ID on her, though. So I'm booking her for attempted auto theft." Arya clenched her fists behind her back, the cold metal of the cuffs digging into her flesh. She could not believe this was real. "You haven't even checked the license plates," she stated again, her voice firm. Cade shot her a look of pure venom. "You can stop talking now," he said, his voice a low, threatening growl, "or I will make sure you regret it." Arya bit her lip, swallowing the torrent of words she wanted to unleash. She knew this was not the time or the place. Instead, she fell silent as Cade and the other officer conferred, every wasted second a fresh insult, a deliberate choice to see her as nothing more than a criminal. After what felt like an age, Cade finally turned back to her. "We'll find out what the real story is once we get you down to the station." Arya didn't fight. She had no more energy for this battle. As the cruiser door slammed shut, sealing her in, she closed her eyes and took a long, slow breath, commanding herself to stay calm. This was far from over. Not yet. She knew the truth would eventually surface. It always did. But the very fact that she was being subjected to this humiliation was a stark, painful reminder of everything she had fought against her entire life. As she stared out the window, watching the city blur into a meaningless streak of color, she couldn't help but wonder how many others had endured this exact same nightmare. People without her power, without her connections, people who had been silenced long before they ever had a chance to speak. And Arya knew one thing for certain. When this was all over, there would be consequences. Arya sat in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, her wrists throbbing from the pressure of the tight handcuffs. The chaotic symphony of the police station played around her, the rhythmic tread of officers' boots, the insistent ringing of phones, and a distant murmur of conversations that blended into white noise. She had been in places like this countless times before, but always on the other side of the table. Now she was the one being processed, the one being treated like a criminal, and the sheer absurdity of it all settled in her chest like a lead weight. Her mind endlessly replayed the last hour. Officer Cade's sneering face, his absolute refusal to hear her, his casual dismissal when she stated her position. He had not even bothered to run her plates. He had performed 0 background checks. Her arrest was built on nothing more than the shaky foundation of his assumptions. She tried to adjust her position on the hard plastic chair they had forced her into, her cuffed hands making any movement awkward. Across the room, Cade was engrossed in paperwork, muttering to another officer who periodically shot a curious glance in her direction. There was no sense of urgency in their movements, no dawning realization of the colossal mistake they were making. For them, this was just another day, another arrest. "Hey," Arya called out, her voice cutting through the noise, trying to get Cade's attention. "Can I at least have these cuffs removed? You know this is entirely unnecessary." Cade didn't even bother to look up from his papers. "Yeah, sure. You just sit tight, and we'll get right on that when we're ready," he replied, his voice oozing sarcasm. Arya sighed, her frustration reaching a boiling point. She had encountered difficult officers in her career, but never one so openly, so brazenly hostile. She was the district attorney, for God's sake. How was this even possible? She had never imagined finding herself in a situation like this, especially not for the crime of searching her own car. But here she was. After an eternity had crawled by, Cade finally sauntered over to her. He leaned down, planting his hands on the table in front of her, his expression still radiating smug satisfaction. "All right, District Attorney," he said, the title a mocking insult on his lips. "You ready to come clean yet?" Arya met his gaze directly, her eyes like chips of ice. "I have told you the truth from the very beginning. I am the District Attorney for this city, and you have made a monumental mistake. But you're too blinded by your own prejudice to even see it," Cade chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Prejudice? Lady, this isn't about prejudice. This is about you not having a shred of proof, acting suspicious, and feeding me a line of excuses. Do you have any idea how many times I hear the 'I lost my ID' story? It happens constantly. You're not special." Arya took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying her nerves. "If you would just run a background check or check the plates on the vehicle, you would have all the information you need. This entire ordeal could have been over by now." Cade straightened up, shaking his head with theatrical pity. "Background check? Plates? Nah, you don't get to tell me how to do my job. You criminals always think you're smarter than everyone else. You're lucky I haven't added resisting arrest to your charges." Arya's hands tensed in the cuffs, but she refused to take his bait. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, her voice low and firm, each word carefully chosen. "When this is over, you are going to regret every second of how you handled this." Cade's eyebrows shot up, but the smirk remained plastered on his face. "Is that a threat? You think you're going to scare me? Lady, I've been on this job for 20 years. I've seen it all. And trust me, whatever little power trip you think you're on isn't going to work on me." Arya didn't respond. She was finished arguing with him. It was pointless. She just needed to get out of this place and let the truth do the work for her. The younger officer from the parking lot approached and handed Cade a clipboard. Cade glanced at it for a second before handing it back, not even bothering to read it. "What about her phone call?" the younger officer asked, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Shouldn't she be allowed to make one by now?" Cade waved him away dismissively. "She'll get her call when I say she gets her call," he muttered, turning his back on both of them. "Besides, who's she going to call? The mayor?" He laughed at his own joke. Arya's frustration morphed into a quiet, simmering rage. She knew the procedure, and she knew this was a violation. But more than that, she knew that Cade simply didn't care. This wasn't about law or justice for him. It was about power and control, and right now he was savoring every moment. A moment later, another officer, an older man with a weary expression, walked into the area. His gaze swept the room, landing on Arya for a brief flickering moment. Was that recognition in his eyes? He masked it quickly, turning his attention to Cade. "Cade, what's the story with her?" the officer asked, his voice gruff. Cade turned, his posture still relaxed and confident. "Just another perp who thinks she's above the law. Says she's the district attorney. Can you believe the nerve?" The older officer raised an eyebrow. "District attorney, huh?" he said slowly, his eyes shifting back to Arya. Arya met his gaze evenly. "That is exactly who I am. If you care to check, I am certain you will find everything is in order." The older officer didn't reply immediately. Instead, he gave Cade a long, searching look. "Might not be a bad idea to run those plates," he suggested, his tone neutral. Cade snorted. "I'll get to it," he said, waving his hand as if it were a triviality. Arya locked eyes with the older officer, silently pleading with him to intervene, but after a beat, he just turned and walked back to his desk, leaving her exactly where she had been for hours, still cuffed, still disbelieved, still trapped. She let out a slow, defeated breath, staring at the scuffed floor. She needed that phone call. She needed someone to come down here and detonate this whole charade, because it was painfully clear that no one was going to help her unless she forced their hand. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Cade strolled back over, his grin as wide and unpleasant as ever. All right, princess. You want your phone call? You got it. Let's see what kind of strings you can pull." Arya said nothing. She simply stood as he unlocked the cuffs, flexing her aching wrists as she walked toward the phone. Her mind was already zeroed in on who she needed to call. This was not over. Not by a long shot. Arya rubbed her wrists, trying to coax the feeling back into her hands after hours spent in cuffs. The phone, an ancient landline, sat on a small metal desk in the corner, a relic from another era that was now her lifeline. She walked toward it, her back straight, her movements deliberate despite the fury churning inside her. Cade leaned against the wall near the doorway, watching her with that same smug, self-satisfied smile, his arms crossed, as if this whole ordeal were a private source of amusement for him. "Make it quick," he said. "Wouldn't want you wasting any more of our valuable time." Arya ignored him completely. She lifted the receiver and dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang once, then twice, before a familiar professional voice answered. "Julian Vance." "Julian, it's Arya," she said, her voice a calm, steady instrument, though it took all her effort to keep the frustration from cracking it. A beat of silence on the other end, and she could almost picture him sitting up straighter in his chair. "Arya, where are you? I've been trying to reach you all afternoon." "I'm at the police station," she stated, keeping her tone even. "The Midtown precinct. I've been arrested." "Arrested?" Julian's voice was sharp, incredulous. "For what?" She glanced over at Cade, who was still observing her with his lazy, arrogant smirk. "They seemed to believe I was attempting to steal my own car," she said dryly. There was a brief silence, then a heavy sigh from Julian. "Which station did you say?" "Midtown precinct," Arya repeated, her eyes locked on Cade. "And I need you to get down here as soon as possible." "I'm on my way," Julian replied instantly. "Don't say another word to anyone. I'll handle everything." Arya hung up the phone, her fingers gripping the receiver tightly for a moment, before she placed it gently back in its cradle. She turned to face Cade, who arched an eyebrow at her. "So who's coming to your rescue?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your lawyer?" Arya's lips thinned into a hard line. "Yes," she said simply, her voice unwavering. Cade pushed himself off the wall, taking a menacing step toward her, his eyes narrowing. "You know, you've got a real attitude problem for someone in your position. Most people would be grateful for a phone call, but you think you're special, don't you?" Arya looked him dead in the eye, her expression a blank canvas he could not read. "I don't think I'm special," she said. "But I do think you are making a catastrophic mistake," Cade chuckled, shaking his head. Sure. I'll believe that when I see it." He turned and swaggered out of the room, leaving Arya standing alone. She took a deep, centering breath and sat down, trying to quiet the storm inside her. This was far from finished, but the knowledge that Julian was on his way brought a small measure of relief. He wasn't just any lawyer. He was one of the sharpest legal minds she knew, and they had worked together for years. He knew how to navigate situations like this, and she trusted him implicitly. Still, the fact that it had come to this was infuriating. She surveyed the small, drab room, its walls painted a depressing shade of gray, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a harsh, unforgiving glow. It was a space designed to make people feel insignificant, powerless. But Arya refused to let it break her. She had spent too long fighting for justice in rooms just like this to be undone by one arrogant officer's baseless assumptions. Time crept by, each minute stretching into an eternity as she sat and waited. The door opened periodically as other officers passed, their glances filled with mild curiosity, but nothing more. No one bothered to check her background. No one bothered to confirm her identity. It was as if they were content to let her sit there forever, just another anonymous face lost in the system. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the door swung open, and Julian Vance strode in. His tall, lean frame filled the doorway, his sharp gray suit a stark contrast to the precinct's dingy aesthetic. He scanned the room, his expression tight with controlled fury, until his eyes found Arya. "Arya," he said, his voice low but steady, "are you all right?" Arya nodded, rising from the chair. I'm fine. But we need to handle this now. Julian turned to the officer who had trailed him into the room. I want to speak to whoever is in charge of this precinct, immediately. The officer, younger than Cade, shifted uncomfortably. I'll get someone, he stammered, before quickly retreating down the hallway. Julian turned back to Arya, his face a hard mask. Unbelievable. They didn't even bother to check your ID? No, Arya said, her voice tight with anger. They arrested me without conducting any kind of background check. They just brought me in based on Officer Cade's assumptions. Julian's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. This is completely and utterly unacceptable. Don't say anything else. I will take care of this. They didn't have to wait long. Officer Cade re-entered the room, his cocky swagger faltering slightly, when he saw Julian standing beside Arya. He paused in the doorway, sizing Julian up. You must be the lawyer, Cade said, his tone still flippant, though a new edge of uncertainty had crept into his voice. That's correct, Julian replied smoothly. And I'm here to inform you that you have made a grave professional error. You have arrested the district attorney without cause, you have failed to perform even the most basic verification checks, and you have violated her rights. I am here to ensure this is rectified immediately. Cade's smirk wavered, but he fought to recover. District attorney, huh? That's the story she's been sticking with, he said, trying to project confidence he no longer felt. Julian took a step forward, his eyes like ice. It is not a story. It is a fact. And if you do not start taking this situation seriously, you will be dealing with a lawsuit so fast your head will spin. Cade's face darkened. You're telling me she's really— Yes, Julian interrupted, his voice slicing through the tension like a razor. She is the district attorney, and you have made a monumental error. For the first time since the ordeal began, Arya saw genuine doubt flicker across Cade's face. He shifted on his feet, his gaze darting between her and Julian, clearly floundering. Well, maybe if she'd told me that sooner— Cade started, but Julian cut him off again. She did, Julian snapped, and you chose not to listen. Now, you are going to fix this, or I am going straight to the police chief. Cade's bravado was completely gone now, evaporated into the stale air of the precinct. He stood there, frozen for a moment, then muttered something under his breath, before turning and storming out of the room. Arya watched him go, her anger simmering just below the surface. She turned to Julian, her expression a mixture of gratitude and lingering tension. Thank you, she said quietly. Julian nodded, his face softening slightly. This isn't over. Let's make sure they process your release properly, and then we will deal with the rest. Arya sat back down, knowing that soon the full truth would come crashing down. But she also knew this was only the beginning. The damage was done and there would be consequences, just not the ones Officer Cade had ever expected. Arya sat in the interrogation room, her hands resting calmly on the cool metal table. The room felt colder now, its sterile atmosphere pressing in on her, but her frustration had begun to recede, replaced by a steely resolve. She knew Julian was handling things, and soon this entire house of cards would collapse. The door creaked open, and Officer Cade entered, his usual swagger visibly diminished. He avoided making eye contact with Arya as he moved to the corner of the room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. His smirk was still there, but it was a pale, uncertain shadow of its former self. A few moments later, Julian entered, followed closely by the precinct's police sergeant, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a weary face. The sergeant carried an air of authority, his eyes immediately sweeping the room. He had the look of a man who had seen too many of these situations and could already tell this one had gone spectacularly wrong. Arya straightened in her chair as the sergeant's gaze fell on her, then shifted to Julian. He cleared his throat, his voice firm and resonant. "All right, let's get to the bottom of this," he said. "I've been informed there has been a serious misunderstanding. Monumental perslicking. You've been detained on suspicion of vehicle theft." "Is that correct?" "Yes," Arya replied, her voice calm and controlled. "But I have explained multiple times that I am the district attorney for the city and that this is my vehicle. Officer Cade refused to check my ID or verify any of my information." The sergeant's gaze shifted to Cade, his expression hardening. Cade, is that true? You didn't verify her identification? Cade shifted his weight uncomfortably, though his posture remained defensive. She claimed she didn't have her ID. She said she lost her purse. I followed protocol for the situation as I saw it. Julian stepped forward, his voice steady and authoritative. You did not follow protocol, Officer Cade. You failed to run the vehicle's plates. You failed to perform any kind of background check. You willfully ignored every piece of information she provided you, including the fact that she is the district attorney. Instead, you racially profiled her and escalated a situation that required no escalation whatsoever. Cade's jaw tightened, his face turning a shade of red. She didn't have any proof on her. I can't just take people at their word. We deal with liars every single day. The sergeant held up a hand, silencing Cade, his expression stern. That's enough. The issue here isn't whether she had identification on her person at that exact moment. The issue is how you handled the entire encounter from the start. Did you or did you not attempt to verify her identity through any other means? Cade looked away, his discomfort palpable. No, he mumbled. Arya watched the exchange, her frustration simmering beneath her calm facade. She had tried to reason with this man, had given him every opportunity to do his job correctly, but he had been uninterested in the truth. Now finally, he was being held to account. Julian took another step forward, his voice rising with controlled anger. And when I arrived, you still refused to acknowledge who she was. You continued to mock her and dismissed my explanation as if it were a joke. You are not just negligent, Officer Cade. You are reckless. The sergeant's eyes narrowed on Cade, who now stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of defensive anger. You need to learn how to handle these situations with professionalism, the sergeant said. This isn't about catching people in lies. It's about doing your job thoroughly. You failed to do that, and as a result, we have detained the district attorney under false pretenses. Cade scowled, but the reality of the situation was undeniable. He was no longer in control, and everyone in the room knew it. I was doing my job, he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Arya finally spoke again, her voice cold and measured. No, you weren't. You were abusing your power. You saw me, and you made a judgment based on no evidence at all. You ignored everything I said because you could not believe that someone like me could possibly hold a position like mine. Cade's eyes snapped to hers, a flicker of anger in their depths, but he remained silent. The sergeant sighed heavily and turned back to Arya. Miss Sterling, on behalf of this department, I sincerely apologize for the way this was handled. We will release you immediately, and this entire incident will be thoroughly reviewed. Arya's gaze remained fixed on Cade as she spoke, her voice unwavering. I appreciate that, but this is not over. There will be consequences, not just for me, but for every single person who has been treated this way and hasn't had the power to fight back. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. The sergeant nodded solemnly. Understood. I will personally see to it that this is addressed. Julian placed a reassuring hand on Arya's shoulder, and she stood ready to leave. But as she walked toward the door, she turned one last time to face Cade. You should have listened when I told you who I was, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Next time, maybe you'll think twice before you judge someone based on nothing but your own assumptions. Cade didn't reply, but his jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. His fists were balled at his sides. It was clear he was still unwilling, or unable, to accept the reality of what had just transpired, even as the truth stared him directly in the face. Arya walked out of the room with Julian by her side, feeling the cold satisfaction of knowing that justice, for this moment, was in her hands. But she also knew this was only the beginning. There were larger battles to be fought, and this was just the first shot fired. The next morning, Arya found herself back at the police station, walking into the familiar building with an air of unshakable determination. Today was different. She was not here as a suspect or a victim. She was here as the district attorney, ready to ensure that Officer Cade faced the full consequences of his actions. The events of the previous day still echoed in her mind, but she had compartmentalized them, focusing only on what needed to happen next. As she stepped into the meeting room, she saw Chief Marcus Thorne waiting at the head of the table. He was a tall, stoic man with a serious expression, his salt and pepper hair slicked back. Officer Cade was seated off to the side, his posture rigid and tense. He looked up as she entered, his face betraying a flicker of raw discomfort, before he masked it with the same hardened expression from the day before. This time, however, it lacked any real confidence. Arya gave a curt nod to Chief Thorne, then took a seat directly across from Cade. The tension in the room was a thick, tangible thing, but Arya remained calm, collected. She knew exactly what needed to be said, and she had no intention of letting Cade off the hook. Chief Thorne cleared his throat and began, his voice even but edged with weariness. "Ms. Sterling, I want to first offer a formal apology on behalf of the entire department for what occurred yesterday. I have reviewed the situation, and it is abundantly clear that proper procedure was not followed. I assure you this will be dealt with seriously." Arya met his gaze, her face unreadable. "I appreciate the apology, Chief," she said, her tone controlled. "But apologies do not change what happened. Your officer racially profiled me, refused to verify my identity, and escalated the situation without any cause." Cade shifted in his chair, his jaw tight. He stared straight ahead, avoiding Arya's eyes, but the tension in his body was impossible to miss. Chief Thorne glanced at Cade before continuing. "I understand, and I agree that Officer Cade's actions were unacceptable," Thorne said. "That is why we are placing him on administrative leave without pay, pending a full and thorough investigation." Arya nodded slowly, but her eyes remained locked on Cade. "That's a start, but this isn't just about me. It's about how many other people who look like me are treated the same way and don't have the power to defend themselves. How many people have been in this exact same situation but didn't have a Julian Vance to call or a title like mine to save them?" Cade shifted again, his discomfort growing more obvious. He finally spoke, his voice low and defensive. "Look, I didn't know who you were, all right? If I had known, things would have gone differently." Arya raised an eyebrow, her voice sharp as glass. "That is the entire problem, Officer Cade. You shouldn't treat people differently based on who they are. You should have followed procedure regardless of my position. But you didn't. You saw a black woman going through a car, and you immediately assumed the worst." Cade opened his mouth to retort, but then closed it again, clearly unable to formulate a response. His usual bravado had vanished, replaced by a simmering frustration he couldn't dare express in front of his superior. Chief Thorne stepped in, his tone firm. "Officer Cade, you were in the wrong. This investigation will determine the ultimate consequences of your actions. You need to understand the gravity of this situation." Cade clenched his fists on the table, his words clipped and defensive. "I made a judgment call based on what I saw. I didn't mean to—" "To what?" Arya interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuse. "To racially profile me? To ignore every piece of information I gave you? To refuse to even run my plates? You didn't make a judgment call. You acted on your own biases." Cade's face flushed with anger, but he swallowed his words, knowing he was trapped. Arya continued, her tone steady but laced with the full authority of her office. "This isn't about you not knowing who I was. It's about how you chose to handle the situation from the very beginning. And frankly, your apology isn't for what you did wrong. It's for getting caught doing it to someone who could hold you accountable." Cade's eyes flickered to the floor, his mouth a hard line. He looked like he wanted to argue, but Chief Thorne spoke before he could. "Ms. Sterling is right," Thorne said, his voice firm. "This department has no place for actions like yours. This is not just a one-time mistake. This is a symptom of a systemic problem, and it needs to be addressed." Arya nodded slightly, acknowledging the chief's words, but her focus remained on Cade. "You should be sorry for what you did," she said, her voice cold. "But not just because you did it to me." Cade glanced at her, his face tight with barely contained frustration. "I wasn't trying to—" "Save it," Arya interrupted again, giving him no quarter. "I am not interested in your excuses. What you did was wrong, and now you are going to face the consequences." Chief Thorne spoke again, his tone more measured. "Officer Cade, you will be placed on leave, effective immediately. A full investigation will follow, and we will be conducting mandatory retraining for all officers to address these critical issues. Arya stood up, her eyes still locked on Cade. "I will be back when the investigation is over," she said calmly. "And if it turns out that this kind of behavior is part of a larger pattern, believe me, there will be more consequences than just retraining." Cade didn't respond this time. He just stared down at the table, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists. As Arya turned to leave, Chief Thorne stood and walked her to the door. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Ms. Sterling," he said. "I assure you this will not be taken lightly." Arya nodded once. "I hope so, Chief. I really do." With that, she walked out of the room, her head held high. This was not over, but the first critical step had been taken. Cade would face consequences, and the department would be forced to confront its failures. But Arya knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. As she left the station, the weight of the previous day still lingered, but it was lighter now. She had stood her ground, and the truth had been brought into the light. Now she would make sure that this kind of injustice didn't go unchecked ever again. There was a long road ahead, but Arya Sterling was ready to walk it. The next day, Arya walked back into the police station with the same focused sense of purpose as before. This time, however, she was not alone. Julian Vance, dressed in his customary crisp gray suit, walked beside her, his presence a quiet but potent reminder of the support she had. Today's meeting was with Chief Thorne and Cade again, but the atmosphere was heavier, the investigation having moved with surprising speed, raising the stakes considerably. As they approached the chief's office, Arya felt the familiar tension settle on her shoulders, but it did not shake her resolve. She knocked once before pushing the door open. Inside, Chief Thorne sat behind his desk, his expression serious and unreadable. Officer Cade was seated in a corner, looking smaller, more deflated than before, his confidence completely eroded by the cascading consequences of his actions. Arya and Julian took their seats across from the chief, their expressions equally composed. Chief Thorne nodded to them both before speaking. "Ms. Sterling, Mr. Vance," he began, folding his hands on the desk before him, "we have completed our preliminary investigation into the incident, and we have reached a decision. Officer Cade's actions were not only out of line, but in direct violation of department procedures. Therefore, we have decided to terminate his employment, effective immediately." Cade's face went rigid, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, his lips pressing into a bloodless line. But he did not speak. There was nothing left for him to say. Arya glanced at Cade for a moment, but her focus remained on the chief. "I appreciate that the department has taken this seriously," she said, her voice calm. "But firing Officer Cade, while necessary, is not enough to address the larger issue." Chief Thorne nodded slowly. "I agree. That's why we are initiating a department-wide review of our training practices, particularly concerning racial profiling and de-escalation protocols. This will not be a simple check-the-box exercise. We will be working with external consultants to ensure that every officer in this department understands the gravity of situations like this one." Arya leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp. "That is a start, Chief. But I want to be very clear. This is about more than just training. This is about changing the fundamental culture of how your officers approach their duties. It is about ensuring that people of color are not automatically viewed as criminals or suspects simply because they don't fit a certain preconceived image. I want to see real, tangible changes, not just on paper, but in the way your officers interact with every person in this community." Chief Thorne met her gaze, his expression serious. "I understand, Mrs. Sterling, and I can assure you we are committed to making those changes. This incident has illuminated some deep-seated issues within our department, and we will not let them go unaddressed." Arya studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. She had heard plenty of promises made in rooms like this before. It was the follow-through that mattered. She was not here for more empty words. She was here for action. Julian cleared his throat, breaking the brief silence. "We will be keeping a very close eye on the department's progress," he said smoothly. "And if we find that the necessary changes are not being implemented, we will be back to ensure that accountability is enforced." Thorne nodded again, his expression grim. "I understand. I will make sure you are kept fully updated on our progress." Arya then turned her attention to Cade, who sat stiffly, his gaze fixed on the floor. She wasn't seeking an apology from him. She knew she wouldn't receive a sincere one, but she would not let him leave without making her point absolutely clear. "Cade," she said, her voice steady, "you had a choice that day. You could have chosen to do your job properly, to treat me with basic respect, and to check the facts. Instead, you chose to act on your own prejudices. You assumed I was guilty because of the way I look, and you escalated the situation because you believed you had the power to do so. Now, you are facing the consequences of that choice." Cade finally looked up, his face pale and drawn. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He simply stared at her, a flicker of resentment in his eyes. Arya didn't need his response. She had said what needed to be said, and the truth of her words hung in the air between them. Chief Thorne cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Officer Cade, you are dismissed. You can collect your personal belongings before leaving the premises." Cade stood up slowly, his body taut, and walked out of the office without another word. As the door clicked shut behind him, the oppressive atmosphere in the room seemed to ease slightly. But for Arya, the weight of the situation remained. She turned back to the chief. "I will be following this very closely, Chief Thorne," she said. "I am glad to see the department taking action, but I will be watching to make sure this isn't just a temporary fix." "There is a long way to go," Chief Thorne nodded. "I understand, Ms. Sterling, and I welcome your oversight. We all want the same thing here, justice and accountability." Arya stood, signaling the meeting was over. Julian rose beside her, and they made their way to the door. Before leaving, Arya paused and turned back to the chief one last time. "I hope you mean that," she said quietly, "because this is just one officer, one incident. The system itself is still broken, and it's going to take a lot more than firing one man to fix it." Chief Thorne gave her a solemn nod, his face lined with the weight of his responsibility. "We will do everything in our power to make sure this never happens again. You have my word." Arya didn't respond. Words were only the beginning. As she and Julian walked out of the station, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the streets. She knew this was a victory, but it was just one step in a much larger, longer fight. There was still so much work to be done, so many more battles to face. But for now, she allowed herself a brief moment of quiet satisfaction. Officer Cade was gone, and the system that had enabled him was finally being forced to look at itself in the mirror. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. And for Arya Sterling, that was something worth fighting for. A week had passed since Officer Cade's termination, but the event still weighed heavily on Arya's mind. She sat in her office, gazing out at the bustling city streets below, the urban symphony barely registering. The battle against one officer's blatant misconduct was won, but it had not left her feeling victorious. The system that had allowed a man like Cade to operate with impunity was still very much intact, and Arya knew she could not rest until real systemic change was set in motion. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her reverie. It was Chief Thorne. She answered, her voice calm, bracing herself for whatever came next. "Arya Sterling." "Ms. Sterling, it's Chief Thorne," he said, his tone formal but more relaxed than their previous encounters. "I wanted to provide you with an update on the internal reforms we've initiated. The department has officially begun implementing the new training protocols. The consultants are now working with our command staff to ensure the racial profiling and de-escalation training is thorough. And I would like to formally offer you a seat on the Civilian Oversight Committee to help ensure we're staying on track." Arya leaned back in her chair, processing his words. "I appreciate the offer, Chief. It is a step in the right direction. But I hope this isn't simply about making things look good on paper." Thorne paused for a beat before responding. "I assure you, Mr. Sterling, this is about more than just appearances. We are committed to making substantive changes, and your insight would be invaluable to that process." Arya considered his proposal carefully. "I'll think about it," she said. "I am not interested in being part of a performance. If I join this committee, It will be to make certain the work actually gets done and that it's done correctly." "Understood," Chief Thorne replied. "We'll welcome your participation whenever you're ready. And again, I'm sorry for what happened. It has become clear that there is a great deal of work to be done." Arya ended the call, placing the phone back on her desk. Chief Thorne's efforts seemed sincere, but she could not shake the deep-seated skepticism that had been cultivated over years of experience. She had seen too many promises of reform lead to nowhere, too many well-publicized press conferences and public apologies that were followed by nothing but silence. She rose from her chair and began to pace by the window, the weight of her responsibility a heavy cloak on her shoulders. Cade's firing had been a necessary consequence, but he was just one officer in a system that had been failing people like her for generations. She thought of the countless others who had faced the same injustices but lacked the power or position to fight back. Her thoughts then shifted to the community meetings she had already begun to organize. They were small gatherings for now, but word was spreading, and more people were starting to come forward with their own stories of mistreatment. It was painfully clear that Cade was not an isolated incident. He was a symptom of a much larger disease, and that was where the true battle lay. A knock on her office door pulled her from her thoughts. Julian Vance walked in, his expression calm but knowing. He didn't need to ask how she was feeling. He could already see it. "Got your message," he said, taking a seat across from her desk. "How are things?" Arya sat back down, letting out a slow breath. Chief Thorne called. "They've started the reforms, and he wants me on the oversight committee." Julian raised an eyebrow. "And are you considering it?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to be involved, to hold their feet to the fire and make sure they're not just checking boxes. But another part of me is just tired. Tired of hearing the same promises, tired of fighting the same fight over and over again." Julian leaned forward slightly. "You've always known this wouldn't be easy. But you are in a unique position, Arya. You can hold them accountable in a way that very few others can." Arya sighed, her gaze drifting back to the window. "I know, it's just, I want this to be real, Julian. I don't want to be a part of something that is all talk and no action. I want real, lasting change." Mark nodded, his voice soft but firm. "Then make it real. Be the one who keeps pushing, who keeps asking the hard questions. You have already started to make a difference, but this is just the beginning." Arya was quiet for a moment, thinking about the meetings, about the stories she'd heard from people in her community, people who had been silenced for far too long. "I've been organizing community forums," she said. "People are starting to come forward. I'm hearing stories that echo my own experience, but most of them don't have the platform that I do. If I take this seat on the committee, I want to bring their voices with me. It is the only way I can ensure this isn't just about me." Julian smiled faintly. "Then do it. If anyone can bring those voices to the table, it's you." Arya nodded, a new sense of clarity settling over her. She could not let the exhaustion win. There were too many people depending on her, even if they didn't know it yet. The fight was bigger than one officer, bigger than one incident. It was about dismantling the biases and systems that had been allowed to fester for far too long. She picked up her phone and began to type a message to Chief Thorne. "I will take the seat on the committee. But understand this. I am bringing the community with me, and we are not here for half measures." As she hit send, a renewed sense of purpose filled her. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but she had never been one to shy away from hard work. Julian stood, sensing the shift in her energy. "You're doing the right thing, Arya, and I'll be right there with you every step of the way." She looked up at him, grateful for his unwavering support. "Thanks, Julian. I'm going to need all the help I can get." After Julian left, Arya remained at her desk, but now her focus was sharp and clear. The small victories of the past week were important, but they were merely the foundation for the much larger work that lay ahead. The system would not change overnight, but brick by brick, case by case, she was determined to tear down the walls that had kept so many people trapped for so long. Arya leaned back in her chair and let her mind settle on the work still to come. She had taken the first step, and there was no turning back now. The fight for justice, for true accountability was far from over. But Arya Sterling was ready. As the day turned into evening, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that progress was in motion allowed her to breathe a little easier. She had taken on the system, and now she was part of the force that would change it. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like justice wasn't just an ideal. It was finally within reach.